seen or heard, watched the news this week. 21-year-old Dylan Roof sat in a prayer meeting for an hour. I'll get through this. At Emmanuel AME Church, before he stood and killed 9 people for nothing more than their skin color. In our sanctuary this morning, I think we must declare our solidarity with our siblings whose sanctuary was violated. I think we owe it to those who have died to reflect on what happened and think about what we can do to make things better. This is not an easy sermon. What happened this week is not an isolated incident, nor, it seems to me, is it the product of a lone, unhealthy mind. What happened is the product of a sick system. Even the geography is significant. 40% of the slaves delivered to the United States came through the port of Charleston. The first shots of the Civil War were fired in South Carolina. For all that time, Mother Emanuel, as the church is known, has been a beacon of hope and justice, the oldest historically black congregation south of Baltimore. The church was founded, you may have read, in the slave era by people fleeing violence and racism in worship services and other churches. 4,000 founding members. It was once burned to the ground by white supremacists after a failed slave revolt led by the church's minister at the time, Denmark Vesey, who was put to death for his alleged part in the plot. For years, members had to meet in secret to evade laws against black people meeting for worship. Booker T. Washington, Dr. King, so many others spoke in the pulpit at Emmanuel. It is a symbol. But in a larger context, Mother Emanuel is just one more black church terrorized by white men in the United States of America. These killings are the product of a society in which the Confederate flag still flies, in which, in the aftermath of a racially motivated mass murder, pundits and politicians this week couldn't even agree that it was race-related. The killings in Charleston are the product of a nation in which, as soon as slavery was ended, laws went into effect to prevent people of color from voting and holding office and receiving equal rights in court, laws which in some way recreated the effects of slavery. The spirit of those laws is still woven deep in our system, certainly into mindsets. We live in a nation in which still in 2015, white is privileged over black. Maybe nowhere more obviously than this week, the treatment of a white man who was handled carefully by police after killing 9 people. Months after a black man was strangled to death for selling cigarettes on a corner. What I'm about to say is hard for me to accept. But I think the same system that produced this racist killer produces daily benefits, daily privileges for people with my skin color. My colleague, Reverend Jake Morrill, in his blog this week, quoted Peggy McIntosh's list of ways to see your privilege as a white person. Just a few of them are: I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. When I'm told about our national heritage or civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. There are many more. Whether we intend to or not, we take part in systems which benefit white skin. Reverend Morrill wrote, for instance, think of housing. Many white families worked hard in the last decade to purchase a house and to pay the mortgage. That's the result of individual effort. Sadly, the Federal Housing Administration created policies in the 1930s that meant white families would have one experience with homeownership and black families would have another. You may have heard the phrase redlining. It is about the value of a house according to its neighborhood. So while a white family paying a mortgage with good interest can build wealth through home ownership over time as the value of their home increases, a black family often paying mortgages with higher interest may not see the value of their home rise nearly so much. Same effort, different outcome, end quote. Of course, there are hundreds more areas of privilege. Documented differences in discipline in schools for white and black children. Differences in access to higher education, in salary levels, mass incarceration now of people of color. All these privileges. And when they're seen to be threatened, the same forces lash out over and over and over again. We have been infected as a culture from our founding days by the disease of racism. A horrible guilt over slavery causes us deep shame, and ashamed people react by attacking. As President Obama said this week in addressing the killings in Charleston, these things don't happen in other developed countries. They are, it seems to me, a result of our deep national shame and our unwillingness to be honest in public, to really mourn all that has happened here, all that keeps happening here. We need to shout from the rooftops that Black lives matter for the same reason Dr. King spoke of his dream years ago, because we have not yet proven it true. But Black lives must matter. 9 human beings, beloveds and lovers, children and parents, were taken by hate, again at the hands of a white man with a gun. What can we do? Journalist Joshua Dubois has some suggestions that I find poignant. After reading what he's written, I'm committed to having these conversations with my family. He writes, "The question now is, will we convince ourselves of the delusion that this killer is the only one who is sick? Or will we examine our national conscience and finally take steps to become well?" One of those steps has to be white Americans having an honest conversation about white culture. Yes, white culture. He goes on, if that sounds shocking, think about this. How many times have we explicitly asked black folks to address the problems of black culture? From fatherlessness to violent music to shootings in Chicago. African Americans engage in these conversations regularly. Now it's time, he says, for my white brothers and sisters to lead their own conversations as well. We need dinner table conversations about how some white children grew up without a racist bone in their body, but others are predisposed to singing songs about the N-word on a fraternity bus. How does that happen? What is the cause and what is the solution? White Americans need to drive that dialogue. We need conversations about how many gun owners are responsible. Many are, but others, surrounded by mortal weapons, seem ready to blow at any moment, searching desperately for an apocalypse to confront or a war to fight. Dubois says, what creates the type of paranoia and fear I'm talking about? This discussion needs to be had at the Lions Club, at the gun range, around tables in white homes. We need conversations about why the moment an African American was elected to the White House, some people wanted him to fail and others desperately sought to, quote, take our country back. Take our country back from whom? And to where? Where is it precisely that some folks would have us go? My brothers and sisters from the majority culture, white Americans, need to have the courage to drive this dialogue he calls to us and help us find some answers. And here's how he concludes. In the meantime, black folks will continue to go to church. We will worship and restore ourselves and mourn as we have done after Trayvon, Michael, Eric, Medgar, Jordan, Tarika, Martin, Emmett, Eleanor, and so many more. We will console and pray and hope that this sleeping country wakes up, that others, self-aware, non-black folks, will see the full horror of Charleston and desire to exorcise the demons of our history and present culture, end quote. I'm grateful that in our congregation, VUU members Beverly McCormick and Barb Quijada are facilitating the course Beloved Conversations, Reflections on Race and Ethnicity. If you haven't yet taken it, I encourage you to do so. It'll roll up again in the fall. It helps folks take the first steps to having honest conversations about their experiences around race. We need to sit down across from one another, look each other in the eye, and talk about racism in our families, in our day-to-day lives, in our hearts, perhaps, and in our culture. Beloved Conversations helps. Interfaith work is another place where this can happen sort of almost naturally. There is more that we can do. In studying this month's theme, compassion, I came across a study conducted several years ago that points to the effectiveness of dialogue-based approaches. I wrote about that study in my newsletter column this week. In the first part of the study, two people were asked to sit down facing one another, put on headphones, and then tap a sensor to the beat of a piece of music that was piped through the headphones. Psychologists David Destino and Piercarlo Valdesolo told their subjects that they were studying music perception. They were told this exercise was to judge their ability to keep time with music, but in truth it was testing a hypothesis about compassion. What the approximately 70 subjects didn't know was that the person sitting across from them was a plant, someone who was working for the psychologist. That plant was instructed to match the rhythm of the subject, in some cases, make sure that they were tapping in time. In other cases, the plant was to tap a rhythm that was asynchronous to the rhythm being tapped by the subject of the study. Tap a different rhythm. The psychologists hypothesized that synchronous tapping would increase compassion and helping behavior on the subject's part. Destino wrote this paragraph in July 14th, 2012 about the next part of the experiment after the tapping was finished. We next had the participants watch their tapping partner get cheated by another plant, another person who was working for the psychologist, which resulted in the plant erroneously being assigned to complete a stack of really difficult word problems. As our participants were leaving, they were informed by an automated message that if they desired, they could help complete some of the work assigned to their partners. If you want, you can stay and help. If they did so, we timed how long they spent working on the task. The results were striking, he says. The simple act of tapping one's hands in synchrony with another caused our participants to report feeling more similar to their partners and have greater compassion for their plight. It increased the number of people who helped their partner by 31% and increased the average time spent helping from 1 minute to more than 7 minutes. Acts of compassion, they found, are increased when we feel the person suffering is more like us than not like us. We are more likely to help when we sense a deep connection. Seems to me that when in worship we sing together, we clap mostly together, we share our stories with one another after, we're building the capacity for compassion. But what's most important, it seems, is shifting the way we think about people we perceive at first are very different from us. Destino said, "There's nothing special about tapping in synchrony. Any such commonality will do. Increased compassion for one's neighbor, for instance, can come from something as easy as encouraging yourself to think of him as, say, a fan of the same local restaurant, instead of as a member of a different ethnicity. Simply learning to mentally recategorize one another in terms of commonalities," he says, would generate greater empathy among all of us. And I would say, allow us then to appreciate our differences, really live into them with one another. There is hope, even now, even in Charleston. This week, Reverend Danny Reed, who's the minister at the UU congregation there in Charleston, wrote a letter to Unitarian Universalists across the country. He asked us to know that the folks in Charleston are much more united than we might think. He said the streets were filled more with abiding faith than with blind rage. No property has been vandalized there. And he says vigils have been marked by diversity and peace. Earlier Friday, he wrote, as the disturbed and poisoned young man who wrought such violence stood at his bond hearing, did you see this? The family members of those he murdered, those people who were most entitled to rage and vengeance, instead spoke about forgiveness and compassion. Examples for all of us in the worst of times. He says, we'll never be the same. Charleston will bear the scars of the assault on Mother Emanuel Church, yet we will not be defeated. The work of justice is never ending and committed to the beloved community. Even in the haunted American South, love will prevail. I believe that. But it will only be so if we work to make it so. I encourage you, pay attention to your privilege. Let us learn together. Have a conversation with someone about your experiences with race and ethnicity. Enroll in the program offered here. There is much that you and I can do. This morning, I'm going to conclude by reading the names of the 9 people who were slain this week. We need to remember them. Even as we mourn their lives, may we recommit ourselves to fighting systemic racism wherever and whenever we find it. May we no longer be quiet where we have been quiet before. After I'm finished reading these names, we're going to sing together a song that, I'll be honest, I don't like to sing very often because I think it's holy. The song that has been sung at Mother Emanuel Church many times, We Shall Overcome, a song that was sung in Selma and has been sung here. It's been sung everywhere people are fighting for equal rights. These are the names of the 9 people. Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Tywanza Sanders, Reverend Daniel Simmons, and Myra Thompson.